you've made a distinction between a shared mattering map and individual mattering projects. So let me start there first. What are mattering projects?
There is a philosopher, he sadly has passed away, an English philosopher named Bernard Williams, and he had this notion, and mine is pretty similar. He called them ground projects, and I call them mattering projects. But the hypothesis is, and I've been testing it for over 40 years, that people in answering what I call this longing to matter, have certain projects that channel this longing. This is the way they try to prove to themselves, yes, they really do matter. And these are the things I call the mattering projects, and they become the focus, or I should say the locus of some of our deepest emotions. When they go wrong, that's when this anxiety producing question bubbles to the top. Do I really matter? So these are and they're very individualized. They're very, very different. There's tremendous diversity between us in how we try to minister to the shared longing to matter. And I sort of map this out on a mattering map, which is, metaphorically represents these various projects, but they can range from, cultivating what seemed to the person their relationship with God, to trying to become famous, to their family relationships. That they vary greatly, and I actually distinguish between what I call the 4 continents of the mattering map, depending on which strategy prevails. So anyway, but what has so interested me for decades now, and I was not planning to write about this, it was a little bit too existential for my kind of philosophy, right? I do analytic philosophy, and it seemed a little too, I don't know, general. But just, I have been talking to people over the years and sort of probing this. What is it that keeps you going, that gives you the impetus to get on with your future, that if you found out it wasn't going well would really cause these kinds of, existential doubts, do I really matter, to bubble forth. And I can give you one really, to me, interesting example. I mean, it amused me very much, but I was waiting in a lobby in a hotel in Manhattan for a friend to come, and a guy comes up to me. This was many years ago, so I was, young, and he's pestering me. He's trying to make me, and I see he's trying to pick me up, and so I start talking to him about his mattering project. It turns out he was what we call a pickup artist. This was his mattering project, to try to pick up as many women as possible. And he had his whole existential being was lodged in this. To me, this is fascinating. It's just, he had his statistics, how successful he is, but, he had his heroes, the men who write books about this, who are very successful at this. And so this, it was just like, wow, human nature is amazing. This longing we all share in virtue of our humanity can express itself in so many different ways, depending on our temperament, our talent, our interest, our culture, just quirks of our personality. It makes us very, very different from each other, this thing that we all have in common.
So this is more like an answer to the question of why do I matter? What's the meaning of my life? And they are all separate and individual. But how does that come into? Do you see any conflicts there? If we, for example, live in a society, and if we each have our own mattering projects, what conflicts might there be?
The deepest and most irresolvable conflicts take place here. You got right to it. That is exactly right. If we stake our life, or the justification of ourselves on these projects, this means that, a lot of our emotions are centered on this. When it doesn't go right, we can doubt our reason for living. And yes, this is what deep clinical depression is. I just will mention in parentheses that the um, suicide hotline in the U.S. it's www.youmatter.gov, right? So this is quite interesting, right? And as you know, a whole national and in some sense international movement was launched years ago um, by the three words Black Lives Matter. I mean, this is deep, right? It gets, I think, to the core of our humanness. So, not surprising, we can be quite intolerant here because what we want is like objective proof. Yes, I'm really, all of this attention that I have to pay to myself in order to pursue a human life, I deserve it, right? I'm doing something with my life that earns me this deservingness of my own attention, which is, wired into our brains. But nevertheless, we want some sort of justification, some sort of objective grounding. If it's really objectively grounding my life, shouldn't it ground everybody's life? So there's this urge to universalize it. So, for example, what we see very clearly in religion, yes, but I have found it to be all across the mattering map that there is this incipient desire, that physicists I've spoken to, yes, I am discovering the laws of nature. This, I am matter discovering what matter is. This really matters. Should everybody be doing this, or at least recognizing how important this is? Or a mathematician, Paul Erdős, a Hungarian who then lived in the United States, a great mathematician, and who said, the point of life is to hypothesize and to prove, that these grand statements about what the point of life is. And so it generates, especially when it's politicized or it's put in the context of religion, it generates great controversies. So, yeah, the answer is you are exactly right.
Yeah. So if we list down human needs, let's say, okay, there's a survival. Let's say once we secure that out, okay, what's next? Happiness, maybe. That depends on how you define happiness.
Yeah.
But you're saying this is the third element, mattering. Why do I exist, and what's the purpose of my existence? And that's where we construct. Would it be fair to say that we are constructing it rather than discovering it? This mattering project and its individual.
Yeah, I think it was very, very important to me. Excuse me. It was very, very important to me to try to ground this longing in hard science. That there is, that why we find this. And I can actually even pinpoint the period of history when it emerged. And it has to be that certain safety parameters of life stability have to be in place.
Yeah.
That is, we can't be struggling for survival 24/7, but and be worrying about this existential question. But once it's in place, we see it coming forth, and there's a period in history where you can actually see it emerging. Scholars call it the axial age. It's the period when all of the religions that are still extant, as well as Western philosophy, emerged. And that would happen between 800 and 200 BCE, roughly. But all these major, what we call normative frameworks about values, emerged and still, are in place, one way or another, no matter what your viewpoint is, secular or religious, you can trace it back to this time when in certain periods of the world, um, life was stable enough for people to ask, well, what's the point of all this? What am I living for? What am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to achieve? And so, yeah. And what we want, I think that this is actually to find a way, a mannering project that satisfies oneself, uh, is one of the keys to a life of flourishing. I don't use the word happiness so much because happiness is an emotion and the emotions evolve to give us feedback about how, how our environment is either hindering or helping our efforts to thrive and survive. So, happiness is not made to last. It's giving us feedback like all of the emotions, but a sense of flourishing or of this long range reflective emotion that that the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia. That this sort of and Aristotle, who spoke about this a great deal, as he says it's not happiness because we're willing to put up with a lot of difficulty and struggle in order to achieve this, which is true. Our mattering projects. I mean, if one's a philosopher, the struggle, the disappointments, the frustration of one's mattering project is something you have to contemplate. The sense like, I don't know anything. And, very, very, it's a difficult mattering project. So many mattering projects are difficult. So it's not happiness per se. It's this sense of flourishing. It's a long range reflective view, just as the mattering instinct is very reflective. You have to sort of step outside of yourself and look at yourself and look how seriously I take myself. Why should I take myself so seriously? Is there anything I can say about myself that would justify this in my own eyes? So that's very reflective. And so is the sense of flourishing that goes there. But still, mattering projects can deliver this sense of flourishing and be very, very good for the individual. And still, certain ethical questions can come in, and it can be a morally wrong mattering project, even if it is ministering extremely well to one's longing to matter. I mean, if I decide that my mattering demands that I invade Poland, I must be stopped, right? So, so there, so in evaluating mattering projects, one doesn't want to only think about how well it's serving the individual, but is it also undermining the mattering projects of others?
Mm, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of makes sense, especially when you mention the modernity aspect. So let's say if I'm a hunter gatherer and I know that tomorrow, my biggest worry is that tomorrow, before I go to hunting, tiger might come and kill me. So in that sense, it's like I don't really have time to think about existential matters and my purpose in life. But let's say we come back to modern life and we don't have such worries anymore, and at that point maybe we are like, okay, what should I do, what's my purpose next? And maybe that's when this quest for mattering emerges, like this now you secured the basic needs and now you are free to worry about your place in the universe.
Exactly. I mean, it is a kind of luxury, in war-torn, areas of the world, which sadly exist right now. But people are just running for shelter, trying to survive their children, their friends. Yeah, the survival instinct, comes in, and so who's thinking about the mattering instinct? It's eclipsed, it's suppressed. So yeah, there's certain things must be in place before this which we share with the other animals. All animals are fighting for their survival and basically, as we now know, neo-Darwinism, it's really so that the genes can be replicated into the future, right? That's what's the mechanism of natural selection. But nevertheless, these are our instincts. They're there. They come into play when survival is demands our full attention. But as soon as our attention is not, will I see another dawn? How do I protect my loved ones to see another dawn? This comes bubbling up. And this is, I've never yet met anybody, and I talk to everybody about this because it's so interesting, from the pickup artist to the mathematician to the religious people. It's just so fascinating to me that, yes, with enough questions, they know what I'm talking about. They have confronted this issue. And what I say, the shortest way for me of encapsulating what it is to be human is that we are creatures of matter who long to matter. And that's really, it's very nice in the English language. You can't do this in other languages to have this noun and this verb. But it's very nice in English that we have this way of almost poetic way of saying what it is that makes us so different from the other species. And that is, as you sort of have already broached, is responsible for our greatest achievements and our greatest atrocities, right? Because, if our need to universalize our own mattering comes at the expense of
Yeah,
others.
even the most evil people. I mean, for example, if you go and ask Hitler, he would rationalize his approach, and he would say he's doing the right thing from his own point of view. But yeah, it's
No,
not really
it's
true.
so interesting. I don't know if you've ever read Mein Kampf, Hitler's
Not yet, but
work.
yeah,
I am
maybe.
telling you, it is fascinating. I read this precisely because I'm thinking of this question. It is filled with his agony of not mattering, which he merged with Germany's humiliation. His humiliation, Germany's humiliation. He had to prove he mattered, meant that Germany, Deutschland über alles, right? So, uh, oh, it's a fascinating read if you can stomach it.
Especially if you are a soldier and for example, you are you have a buddy, and next day, I mean, you are chatting with them, and next day their legs might be blown off and everything. So that changes your psychology, I assume. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the humiliation that Germany suffered after World War One, the Versailles Treaty, oh, you know, it just the humiliation was profound. And humiliation means I don't matter. Others are telling me I don't matter. And and Hitler experienced this, so personally because he had his own psychological problems that were in sync. I mean, I would put this psychological analysis on our own dear leader at the moment in the United States of America. That this is a man he's never satisfied. He must have every creature on the planet thinking about him in order for him to feel that he matters. He must put his name up everywhere and spread his gaudy gold everywhere. I mean, to me, so it really shows with a little bit of charisma and a almost diseased sense of mattering that nothing really can satisfy you. This can make history in very bad ways, and I see it
Yes.
playing out right now in my own country.
So it's interesting when your individual mattering projects comes into relationship with the reality, that sometimes reality might dictate that you abandon this. For example, we know that Hitler was delusional towards the end of the war, and even in the beginning, when his generals were saying don't attack Moscow and St. Petersburg at the same time, but he was like,
Yeah.
no, 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 I believe that we can beat them. But it's
Yeah.
like can there be a point like in individual's life that their mattering projects comes into this clashing with the reality, and reality crashes them, and what does the normal person do in that case?
What a
Abandon the
normal person. Yeah. This
yeah.
is a sign of sanity, right? When you let reality, you know, and I have in the book, stories of people, very sane people who, who y- it was it was not, at a certain point, they saw it's not contributing to their flourishing. So I will give you an example of this. A friend of mine, but he's also, he's written about this. He's now a writer. He has a great musical talent. It emerged very young, his musical talent does, and he chose, because he fell in love with it, the classical guitar. And it's hard to make a living from the classical guitar. He got into the best conservatory here in Boston, and he was a star in some sense. But it's hard to, orchestras don't hire classical guitarists, composers don't write concerti for the classical guitar. You either make it as a soloist or you're playing, for weddings and bar mitzvahs. It's just not. And so he went to Vienna. He was in Vienna, and years and years went by, and this was his life. It was his passion. Practice, practice, practice. It was his soul. It was his soul project. And he finally, he saw, he was, the ratio of misery to happiness was too great, right? The misery, he couldn't, and he left it. He suffered greatly. It's like a love affair that, the lover leaves you. And for years, he couldn't even listen to music. I think this to me is like so much like a sad love affair, but sometimes, when we get over the disastrous love affair, we finally can look and become friends with this person. You see what attracted us so much. They become our friends. This is a very nice thing to happen. That's what he finally was able to do. He was able to become friends again with music. He practices. He can certainly listen to music. I've met him a few times at concerts. We hadn't planned to meet there, but there he was. And he took up something else, writing. He got a doctorate in comparative literature. He writes books. He's made films. He turned that artistic urge into something else. And it takes tremendous courage to do this. But this is sanity. And sometimes one needs therapy to do this, or just like, sometimes you need therapy to get over a love affair that the ratio of misery to joy has become intolerable.
It also depends on probably how high you aim. Yeah, if your only success criteria is that I will be successful, my mattering project will be successful if I am as good as Beethoven or Mozart, and otherwise I'm a failure. So it becomes some kind of a very impossible project.
Exactly. So many of our mental problems come from, this sort of thing. Yes, I know a philosopher, a very, very good philosopher. Brilliant, I would say. But he wants to be caught. And he has suffered. That is, he wants a new paradigm that, philosophy will have to think this way from now on. And he has suffered from terrible depression. To the point of having to spend time, in hospitals. Yes. So all of this, this is, I'm always suspicious of sort of monocausal theories that this is the cause of everything. And it's why, even though I've been thinking out these ideas for the past over 40 years now, I was very reluctant to publish it in a book because I was worried that I was just seeing it everywhere. But maybe, and that's why it was so important for me to try to generate it from basic science. This is why we have this great longing. And I start with physics, with the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. And there's an explanation for why we have this longing, and why, therefore, it seems to emerge all over the place in our political problems, in our mental problems, and
Hope you're finding this conversation interesting, and if so, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify. as this helps the show reach more people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episode. Now, back to the conversation. Do you think modernity makes it harder to matter today? Because, look, like everything is measured, everything is monitored, everything is controlled. You, by yourself alone, cannot change politics if you even just vote. You can change the price of oil or whatever. So is it becoming more difficult these days?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think that there's a reason we're suffering a crisis of mannering. I think we are suffering a crisis of mannering, and that brings out the worst in us because we need it so badly. And if there's not enough mattering to go around, uh, we scramble like a bunch of children under a piñata, trying to get as much as we can, fighting each other. We become very adversarial, and this is not good. Obviously, again, this is a way of why. Well, I think one of the reasons is, and I speak as a non-religious person, I speak as an atheist, as a matter of fact, but when religion was more or less supplying the means to this mattering longing, and that is the strength of religion. It's you were created by that which created everything, the physical world without and the moral order within. You were intentionally, purposefully created and have therefore a role to play in the narrative of eternity, right? It's like you are here because the eternal chose you to be born and figure out what your role here is. Oh my God, what a sense of mattering that provides, cosmic mattering. And I have spoken to many, many religious people. And when they ask me about my own religious beliefs, and I say, no, that's not my way. It's like, what gets you up in the morning? Why? How do you have the strength to pursue your life? It's, so look, and now, we are living in an age of secularism. And, for many of us, that way is just not a live option, to believe, to
Yeah.
believe this.
It's like
And
religion kind of did that job for us before, yeah, creating these
yeah,
individual now burden is on us.
it's on us. Yes, which is, I think, wonderful. I think we should, but we don't have that sense of certainty, which is good. I mean, the sense of certainty, it has a history of bloodshed, this sense of religious certainty, So, but, but yet in terms of, yeah, a personal, I know that I matter. I matter in the eyes of God. I was made in the image of God, that kind of, yeah. So there's that coupled with, I would say, our society was, presenting pictures, models of what it is to really matter, that there are some people who really matter. And what are they? They are now I speak as an American, but I think this is not just American. They are the extraordinarily rich, the extraordinarily powerful, the extraordinarily famous, always often wrapped up in one and the same thing, powerful, rich, and famous. And this is a model of mattering that most people can't attain and maybe don't even want to. I mean, I don't. I want to pursue my philosophy projects. I don't want to make a lot of money or be famous or be powerful. Only powerful in terms of ideas, right? So, um, but it's very influential. And just think of this thing, so many millennials and younger people I talk to. What do you want to be? An influencer, right? That this is now a mattering project to be, and it's easier to be famous now, to have many people paying attention to you because of social media. So before you had to do something, wondrous and talented, but now, it's much easier to have large followings. And as you say, there's a metric. You can see how much do I really matter, in terms
Attention
of,
is rewarded, yeah,
yeah,
nowadays.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Attention is rewarded. And so, and it feels good. I mean, which is interesting, that we're really, and this is very deep in my analysis, this I believe, I would argue very strongly, that this mattering instinct has to do with our relationship with ourselves, that it's really it's an existential confrontation with yourself, and but do I really deserve all the attention that I have to give myself in order to pursue my life? But do I deserve it, right? Um, but if a lot of other people are paying you attention, that could be very good grounds for feeling, oh yes, I really do. I deserve, this attention. I mean, all these strangers
Yeah,
are
otherwise,
paying
why would
attention.
they follow me? Yeah, otherwise, why would they pay
Exactly.
attention to me? Yeah.
Exactly. But if fame, really seems, without people analyzing too much, seems this is what I need. I need to be famous. And some people find it really is quite hollow when they attain it. And some people find it to be very, very satisfying. I tell this story about, oh God, I forgot his name. He's a very famous movie star. But anyway, it'll come to me. But he got sick of people always coming over to him. He couldn't go out into the streets without people running over to him. So he got a prosthetic nose and
Oh,
eyeglasses and a wig. He went out. Oh God, what's his name? Anyway, and and he and then he wrote. He was being interviewed, and he wrote, um, it really worked. And he said, this really sucks. There are no people coming over to me all the time and asking me and telling me how much they love me. There, I had to wait online to get a fucking cup of coffee. This just sucks. He took off the prosthetic nose, for some people, yeah, it's good to be famous.
a realization that you are also a peasant like the rest of us. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So, yeah. Anyway, I mean, to many people, it holds absolutely no desire whatsoever because they have different mentoring projects. But we need something, we need for me to write the kind of books that I want to write that make me feel worthwhile in my own eyes. I'll never be famous. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to me.
Okay, if you go back to that religious part where religion traditionally playing that role, and in the age of secularism that disappearing, do you think Spinoza foresaw this and tried to solve that problem for us? And if he tried to do it, was he successful or not?
Yes. So you know that I love Spinoza very much. I have a book on betraying Spinoza, the renegade Jew who gave us modernity. Yeah, he's an amazing guy. And his view of God, which is really to understand what he means by God, it's very much what physicists nowadays call the theory of everything. This and which they talk about. Stephen Hawking, for example, in his book "Brief History of Time," he ends with this sort of a prayer, almost to the final theory of everything, quoting Einstein, who Einstein loved Spinoza. When Einstein was asked, as he was asked over and over again, do you believe in God? He would say, I believe in Spinoza's God.
Yep.
Well, what does that mean? Was very clever. We know that Einstein was very, very clever. This is not the Abrahamic God, the God who created nature, who chose the laws of nature and, created us and all of this from outside. No, this is nature itself. But the final theory of nature, which not only would state the final laws, the most fundamental laws in their most elegant mathematical expression, uh, but would also, because it's the theory of everything, it explains everything. It would explain why these must be the laws and no others. And third, it must explain, because it explains everything, why there must, based on these laws, there must be a, a world, a physical world for them to describe, that these laws themselves entail existence. So, we're nowhere near the final theory of everything, but physicists hope that there is, yes, even if we can't get to it, that there is such a final theory of everything so that there's nothing left out, nothing unexplained. And the amazing thing is Spinoza, at the very dawn of modern science, 17th century, He was a contemporary of Galileo, right? Who was the first to really uh, changed the whole course of modern physics. That made mathematics at its heart, rather than the teleology of Aristotle. That he foresaw this idea that ultimately the laws of nature will be able to explain themselves and existence and everything. And that's his God. So it's such a different kind of God. And it's not a God that cares about us. And he says that, he derives that in his Euclidean mode, all consisting all of proofs, axioms, definitions, and then proofs. So he derives that God, if you understand by God this, uh, doesn't care about us. But we can care about that God. We can gain our perspective from that God. We can even gain our solace by that God, to know that we are entailed by this grandeur, makes us partake of this grandeur. But we have to so train our minds, and Spinoza's magnum opus, the Ethics, is trying to do that to our minds so that we can intuit, get glimpses of Deus sive natura, of that which can be thought of as God or as nature. And in that way, our whole sense of identity is expanded. It's almost a little bit like Buddhism, that to the extent that but you do it through reason, through the understanding, which, at least in Buddhism, doesn't have so much faith in. But yes, Spinoza's a philosopher. So yes, he has faith in reason getting there, but to the extent that I really am, see myself, in this perspective, sub specie eternitatis, he says, under the form of eternity. To that extent, I begin to identify less with my little self and more with the whole grandeur, and it can even reconcile me to my own mortality. So
Mm.
it's that kind of, yeah, it's that
So
kind
even
of
if you
world.
have a tragedy happening in your life, there must be a grand purpose. Yeah, it's very interesting. Just to steelman the case against Spinoza. Okay, this human nature, let's say, have a tendency to rationalize the things that we can't change. But can we argue for or against that Spinoza might be falling in the trap that, okay, there are some things that we can change, but this is how we can find solitude, by believing that there must be a final cause that we don't yet understand. But what if there is no cause? What if it's just everything is random and so on?
Yeah. So that is the basic premise of his whole system. Nothing is random, so you have to buy that, which to him is like a principle of logic. It's like the law of non-contradiction is true. We don't have to prove it, because how could you prove it? I mean, you need it in order to prove anything. To him, um, this claim that nothing is random, that you trace back, you trace back, you trace back to causes, and then you just get to, well, dead end. That's it. There's no explanation for this. To him, this like sort of negates the whole rational enterprise. Look, we can get so far tracing explanations, and now you're going to tell me at the basic level, there's no explanation. To him, this is a violation of the whole rational project in which he so believes. So yeah, you're right. And I like to read Spinoza in juxtaposition with David Hume, because both extraordinary, willing to carry out their reasoning to the bitter end, even if it's very counterintuitive, but so disagreeing on this point that you immediately zeroed into. What if it is all random? What if, if it's just brute at the bottom, brute contingency? One says, yeah, could be. I think it is. Let's see where that takes us. The other says, can't be. It violates the whole rational order. Another thing I don't like about Spinoza, I like Spinoza very, very much. And to me personally, it, it goes along with my Mannering project. I like it very, very much, but I don't like it because it almost says, look, to really lead the life that we ought to lead. And he calls his book Ethics, the Ethics, right? We have to be very smart. We have to follow these subtle, torturous chains of reasoning. And most people, it wouldn't satisfy most people. Just like I hate the model of you must be powerful, famous, and rich in order to matter. That there's an elitism, I would say, sadly, I would say, in Spinoza's view of what the ethics is. It really, sort of leaves the masses of people out. They don't matter as much as those who can follow this rational project. So, I mean, he gives us many wonderful ethical rules along the way. And that, to the extent that we're working towards our own flourishing, we ought to work toward the flourishing of all others, that nothing should matter more to us than our fellow man, except for this, but in a practical term. So he's able to give us many ethical truths that one can accept along the way. And to me, his project is grand and marvelous. And yes, I love it, but there's something elitist. It can't. And, if he falls into that urge to universalize, well, that's the urge that I think ought to be resisted.
Yeah, that's where also Aristotelian ethics might enter. Yeah, I think he argued that, okay, we need virtue, we need this universal understanding and everything, but at the end of the day, you also need external goods, money, health, and body, which is in your power, and you must go and get it, basically. Can't rely
And
on it.
he wants you to do that. He wants you to do that. But in terms of ministering to this existential longing we all have, here's the way to do it. These things must be in place. Yes, but they don't look to them in fact, in one of his shorter things on the improvement of the understanding, he actually tells us, that he was thinking, what is it that will give, ever stable happiness, what I would call flourishing or life satisfaction. And he goes through it's not physical pleasure, it's not fame, it's not wealth, it's not power. What could give it? And then he writes the ethics to tell us what can give it, but it requires, oh my gosh, it's not for everybody. Right. It's almost as if
Yeah.
it's a little bit like, Socrates saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, not everybody's going to devote themselves to what he means by the examined life, which basically involves philosophy.
You famously brought Plato to real life with the book Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away. Okay, let's flip this and insert another person. Yeah, let's say we bring the Spinoza back in 21st century, and Spinoza lived a very difficult life. Yeah? He was outcasted by his society, community, but he's now back in the world, and we live in the age of internet, social media. I could guess that he would be cancelled like much more violently this time. Yep.
Um, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly tolerated to be an atheist in our day, in the way that it was, and it's very tolerated. It has been ever since the Enlightenment, which Spinoza so influenced, to say that we can draw our ethics from something other than the great lawgiver beyond. And so, and these are the things that most um, incensed his society, that he was saying we can explain why there's something rather than nothing without appealing to a transcendent God. God means something totally different. And, and we can ground ethics on something totally different than the word of God. And so, and this is fine. Philosophers have been saying this certainly ever since the Enlightenment. So, But I think he would be, I don't know what his, what's good, it's a funny thing. What would Spinoza make of our
Yeah, I
society
mean, if
that,
you imagine there are wars happening and everything, I mean, he wouldn't probably say that it's good that it's happening, but at the deep level, there must be some connection, and you can see that that's read out as like justification for that
yeah.
suffering
Well,
and everything.
he did, as all elitists, who valorize reason and intelligence, he didn't have, great respect for the bulk of mankind, humankind, like Plato, right? They didn't really, uh, Plato, as you know, even argues against democracy, because, mob instinct, it does not have, it's that same kind of, there are the few who have the capacity for reason, and then it must be trained. It's very, very hard to be rational. And that means, the bulk of the people should be controlled, by the philosopher king. You see, I have Socrates right behind
Yeah,
me with
that's nice.
a plant growing out of his head. I guess to show he still lives, right? But
Yeah,
um, it is, yeah. So I think, I don't think he would be, he was always appalled by the bulk of humankind. I mean, when when he was living, just to say that we can objectively, secularly ground our ethics was caused to be ostracized. He was described as Satan's emissary on this planet. you know. So, yeah, would he be surprised that there are still wars and that people are, wasting their lives on stupid stuff, right? No, maybe he would be appalled that although the kind of reason that he had argued for and that gave birth to the Enlightenment, and it did change society, that we do have, he was a fan of democracy. We do have, governments that were changed in the light of philosophers like John Locke, who was a contemporary of Spinoza's, um, that, you know, we're still bumbling our way forward, and making trouble for each other that we ought not to be making, and that there is terrible, terrible violence, and that even with the freeing of philosophy to think out these things, how much has changed. Some things have changed, a lot hasn't. Um, I don't know. I like this idea. I'm thinking maybe I should write a little piece. Spinoza, Spinoza.
I did thought the idea belongs to me, so please cite
I
me
will
there.
footnote you for sure. Yes. Or maybe you want to write it.
Yeah, but why does Plato hate democracy? We have this book by Karl Popper, yes, like the Open Society and the Enemies, and he argues against Plato,
Oh yeah,
basically him being the totalitarian. So is this kind of a lazy overgeneralization, or is there some truth to that?
yeah. I think Popper goes too far, in calling him a totalitarian. But um, I think there are two ways of answering your question. It was the democracy that put Socrates to death, after the Peloponnesian War, and the oligarchy that had been set up by the winning side, Spartans, cleared out. Democracy is reinstated. One of the first things they did in 404 BCE was to put Socrates on trial for his life and the capital crimes of corrupting the youth and introducing false gods. So and corrupting the youth just meant, well, yeah, basically asking them to question everything, including the fundamental premises of this Athenian society. Yeah. So, and it is more complicated. There's Alcibiades. There's lots of stuff.
If
But okay,
Socrates just minded his own business and like nothing would have happened, but he chose to question everything.
yes, 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 or make people at least justify the things they believed. Come on, let's see, let's dig out your premises, and more often than not, their premises were self-contradictory, or, they just stopped short. They didn't know how to, and, they're saying, oh, yeah, this is what he meant by the examined life. Um, but, and he was told, cease and desist, stop doing it. They didn't want to kill him. They didn't want to make a philosophical martyr out of him. And he was a lovable guy, he was, and, but he wouldn't cease and desist. This was his mattering project. And that, and it's really so interesting to me that it shows, I mean, and many, many examples that show that people, their mattering projects matters to them more than life itself. Socrates
Mhm.
would rather die. He knew he was going to die. Um, Rather than give this up. It's so,
Yeah.
so very deep. So, yeah. So, and Plato, that certainly didn't make him look kindly on the democracy. And it was, the but in general, this outlook, you're an elitist, you think, our salvation lies in reason, figuring, and it's hard. Only certain people have the capacity, he has his noble eye, that there are the people made of gold and those that are made of silver and those that are made of brass or some are lead, maybe, I don't know what, and so, there's a kind of innate difference, but even then, the Republic tells you how those who can possibly become philosopher kings, that the arduous education and cultivation that they must go through. They have to study math for 30 years before they can, you know. So, it's so of course he feels like the bulk of people are irrational. They don't know how to think at all. They don't know right from wrong. They don't even know how to think about these questions. And yet the democracy empowers them, And so this is wrong. So he has both his autobiographical reasons for hating democracy, what it did to Socrates, but his philosophical reasons for hating democracy. And he says, that the next step after democracy is demagoguery, is the demagogue, the demagogue who is a tyrant. Um, because the populace is so susceptible to propaganda, it can be swayed so easily. They don't know how to think. Is his thing. And you know what? I don't like this view of Plato, but do you wonder why it often crosses my mind living in this time in the United States, when we have this situation, a man who was elected a second time, a demagogue. And
You're
yeah,
saying maybe Plato had something
I
accurate there. Yeah.
hate to think so. I hate to think so. But and again, I would say, Plato was maybe wrong. If the bulk of the populace feel as if they matter, they won't be as susceptible to this. I don't think that, that is taken into account by Plato. And if people are feeling, I don't matter. Look, these other people are rising. Used to be white males felt in the United States. Look, or maybe I don't matter so much in society, but I matter more than women. I matter more, than my wife. I can tell her what to do. I have the rights. Or I matter more in the United States very much, this feeling. I matter more than black people. I am white. I matter more than black people. So, and now, with what people like me consider progress, social justice, it feels to many people that their mattering has been stolen from them. That these, especially, oh my God, when a black family was occupying the White House, for people like me, this is, oh my God, finally, to, but to other people, and you can really see, you can actually, social scientists have traced this. The amount of racist jokes skyrocketed when the Obamas were in the White House. There was that sense of something is being taken away, and that has made at least people in this country who feel a dearth of mattering, um, as if mattering has been taken away from them, very susceptible to this kind of message, it's all the fault of the immigrants. It's the fault of the people of color. So, so it's not just lack of intelligence, I would say. I would say is lack um, of being nurtured by society, yes, so as to made that to feel like you matter.
Yeah. Should also mention in the times of Plato, what democracy meant was also quite different. Yeah. In
Yeah,
ancient Athens, they would literally meet and then decide we are going to expel this person out of the city because they did this, this, this. There was
yeah.
no checks whatsoever about like should we deliberate further or no. If majority decides this, we are going to do this.
We're going to vote. Yeah, the ostracism. Yeah, that would take place, and that was to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful.
Yeah.
So they did have this notion, and it was not. It was a. It wasn't a representative democracy. The citizens themselves, who only consisted of men, right? Of course. And, there were many slaves. It was a slave society. And even foreigners who lived in Athens were not citizens and couldn't vote. So Aristotle, for example, would not have because he wasn't born in Athens. So it wasn't. But to be a citizen was to have tremendous amount of power, equal power with all the other citizens.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So
Especially in the case of Aristotle, when he was a student of Plato, but when we look at how he approaches politics, it's like a scientist approaching. It's never like there is one clear answer, because I think he mentions that monarchy would be best if there was one single virtuous person, but usually we don't have it. That's why
yeah,
democracy is also not good. So we need to kind of come to an agreement, and maybe polity, where we will have uh, like the balance between democracy and oligarchy, and that would balance things out. So I think
yeah,
it's
yeah.
more like balanced approach.
Yeah, and yeah, no, he is, and he is always, the mean between the
Yeah.
extremes. This is his approach to everything, to ethics, to everything, the golden mean, and yeah, much more practical kind of a philosopher. Plato is he is willing to carry his ideas to their logical conclusion, and even and there is this great faith in reason, that only the few uh, have. So yeah, I
Yeah.
don't, although I love these two philosophers. I love them very much. I love their systems. Uh, I love I love that philosophy to them is not just a 9 to 5 job. It's supposed to remake you. It's supposed to. And so many professional philosophers, they don't believe this. It's almost like a kind of intellectual game, but as an approach to how ought we to live, and if we have to change our ways in the light of the conclusions we live. Aristotle's statement that the conclusion of the practical syllogism is an act. That is, you don't reach the conclusion, oh, this is what ought to be done, and then okay, lovely, I proved it. No, the conclusion is you act. So that I love that Greek notion of what philosophy is all about.
Especially the concept of this. Yeah, you mentioned professional philosopher. It's a kind of a paradox. I mean, if Plato was here and he saw someone claiming to, I'm a professional philosopher, he would
Yeah,
he's very
yeah.
sad. Yeah.
And I'm worried about tenure and how many publications I have and how many citations I have and all the stuff that academics worry about. I mean, that's why my own relationship with academia is uneasy. Right? I float in, I float out because, you know, I need philosophers to talk to, right? You have to bounce your ideas off of philosophers, right? And you want them to bring up the objections and the counterexamples and all the things we're trained to do. And yeah, because you want to test and you want the experts to come up against the experts. So yeah, you need that. But because my notion of philosophy and what it is to be a philosopher is that it's to remake your soul, you know, that after a while I get tired of hearing the gossip, the academic gossip, who's up, who's down, who's this, who's that, and I'm out again.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a betrayal of the pursuit itself. Yeah, if let's say all the academics they sit around the one time, let's say they gather, the topic that they discuss isn't about science but about administrative issues all the time. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so much of one's time is taken up by that sort of thing. Yeah, it's not Plato's Academy. Let's put it that way. But speaking of Plato's Academy, the word is that Plato. He had Aristotle there, who of course was not a Platonist. It was all his intuitions go the other way. And supposedly, Plato welcomed, not only tolerated but welcomed this pushback from nobody less than the great Aristotle. So I think he was happy for this. So and you see his views changing over the course of time, Plato, which is another thing I love about him. You
there's a
know,
great line. I think it's in the Politics of Aristotle, or I may not remember. Might be the Ethics, Nicomachean where right before he starts to criticize Plato, he says, even though friendship is valuable, we should put truth above the friendship. And
yeah,
right after that he starts criticizing Plato. So it's like,
exactly. That's
I
beautiful.
value my friend, I value my teacher, but I have to speak the truth the way I believe it.
That's right. And he was lucky that he had such a teacher who would tolerate and even welcome, I think, because that's the true philosophical spirit. Keep the ego out of it. It's hard. It's hard. But, if a philosopher can't do that, I don't know. It bothers me. It's because, also it's such a luxury to be a philosopher. Good Lord, um, to be to get a salary for thinking about what you love to think about is such a privilege. And so I just I feel that people should come up to the level of this privilege. So anyway, this is why I both love academia and hate academia.
Let me ask you this. What's the difference between being informed and being wise? Why do I ask this question? I had a conversation recently with another great guest, cognitive scientist John Warwacke. He gave this example where he says, in my lectures, when I ask students, where do you go for information? They say almost immediately, I go to Google or whatever AI tool. But when you ask, where do you go for wisdom? Silence. So what's the difference between like being informed and being wise?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm thinking about this very, very much because, like everybody, I'm thinking about AI, right? Which has surprised us all in how the advance is just extraordinary. And I don't know if you played around with it, but I play around with it a lot. And I am shocked. I am shocked. I mean, intelligence? Yes, yes, these are intelligent. I mean, I ask it, I give it the right prompts to come up with an argument. You know, it comes up with a damn good argument. Give it the right prompt to come up with objections to the argument it just constructed. It does it, sometimes in ways that astound me. And yeah, I feel, oh, yes, intelligence. Yes, it is. Yes. Um, but when then I ask it I just had this experience 2 days ago. I said something like, you are certainly, this is very intelligent. You are, this is what you just did here. It's very intelligent. And you surprise me. Does it make you feel good? or something, I don't know. And, and it immediately came back. I don't know what, I'm not capable of this. I'm not capable of looking at myself in this way. I don't know, I don't know what this
Not
question
yet, yeah?
means. Yeah. Yeah. We will say when it does, what we're going to have on our hands are non-carbon based humans. I mean, when they start expressing a longing to matter, we got to watch out, right? Because we're going to have to totally rethink their rights and what we owe them and all of that, right? Ethics, all these ethical questions. I think we should stop before we get to that point, right? It's complicated enough to deal with humans. Yeah, and what's coming to them. I mean, we're not doing a very good job of that. Let's not let's not bring in a whole other.
We humans, we haven't even defined our individual mattering projects. Let's define that first before moving to AI. Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, we might be get more than we bargained for it here. So let's be very careful and think about this next step very carefully. Anyway, uh, but you know, it's but I think about that. Yeah. So what's the difference between knowing that something is true and understanding it in the way that changes your mind and that you have to process and think of the implications and all of that. So, I mean, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I learned that there was this great mathematical result with philosophical implications, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And I knew what it said. My professor told me what it said, and my professor told me that it was true. I knew it was true. Right? I knew that Gödel thing, that in any formal system of arithmetic or any formal system of mathematics that's rich enough to express arithmetic, there will be true but unprovable propositions. I knew that was true and very surprising, but I didn't know why it was true. I hadn't assimilated. I didn't understand it, right? It had not changed my wisdom meaning the whole of me, the whole sense of me and what is true and what that entails and what I must do in the light of this. That's what wisdom is. It's this personal assimilation of understanding why something is true and what it entails and what it doesn't entail. And that is work that goes beyond, information. And yes, I would say AI can help us even with this, with the proper prompts. I say it can generate certain amount of, of understanding why something is true, give you the argument. But, to follow each step and to really, take it into yourself, especially as it will affect how you think about your life, what it ought to be, how you ought to act towards others, what you owe institutions, all of these big questions. It can't answer that question precisely because of what it told me. It does not know what it's like to be a human living in a human society. It doesn't know what it likes, what it's like to feel that certain things matter and certain things don't. It has no sense of mattering. It all matters the same to it. There's no sense of matter, and then when it gives me an argument, then I say, well, construct for me the argument for the opposite conclusion. It will do that. And I'll say, which one do you most appeals to you? It tells me I don't make those distinctions. None of it matters to me more than anything else.
It's
So
also designed to give you the most predictable and relevant and safe approach based on the information that it has gathered and it has been fed on. So
yes,
it will rarely go against it will rarely bring the novel idea that has we haven't never thought about Plato or
absolutely.
Aristotle before.
Absolutely. And and it's really very, very important what prompts you give it. The user, so I don't think that it's ever going to make us redundant, I mean, this question I just get all the time now. We're not going to matter anymore. We are Homo sapiens. Our role is to be knowers, right? That's the niche we filled in natural selection. And, we're pitifully weak. We can't fly. We can't swim, underwater for very long. We're pitiful. But this big brain that we evolved, this is our niche, this is our niche. So, and that we're going to be outdone by them. And then, in some sense, yeah, they're already in many spheres super intelligent. I mean, I was just reading a mathematician saying, that AI is going to be, is now his co-pilot, his co-collaborator. And that's what it's going to be for the rest of mathematical for mathematics from now on. And I feel sad about this. It takes away a little bit of the grandeur of these mattering projects, but I don't think it's depending on our prompts. It depends on us telling us what matters to us, and as you say, to come up with something totally out of the box, because it's generative AI. What it's generating from is all the knowledge and that we have fed into it. The entire archive of our knowledge is dumped in there, and it statistically can analyze it and give us amazing results. I mean, it does astound me when I think about how it's doing this. And I know philosophers who say, oh, what this shows is that this is what our intelligence is. It's nothing but, a statistical analysis of everything that's come before. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at
I
all.
think
But
it might be a good introduction. Yeah, for example, let's say I have never read about Nietzsche and I don't know him, what he wrote about. I mean, this can lower the cost of me entering into that field by understanding it, like getting the introduction to his philosophy. Okay, this is Nietzsche. This is what he wrote. These are his main ideas. But that's not the end of the road. Okay, to understand Nietzsche really well,
yeah,
I have to do the hard work of reading him myself rather than relying on the output generated by ChatGPT.
exactly. For your mind to be really changed, it's not just putting as many true statements, packing them into your brain as possible, right? It's not just that. It's something, that reflective and deep, and, requires a lot of work. Yeah. So it's funny because I don't know anything about, or very little superficial knowledge of Heidegger. And I have a Substack, and I had mentioned this, that I know nothing really about Heidegger. I got a lot of pushback from Heideggerian philosophers, and, why not? Why don't you, And, and I don't, because to me, because of my view of what philosophy is, that the fact that, you know, the, the conclusion of his practical syllogism was to be a Nazi is like modus tollens, if P implies Q, not Q, then not P. His action that was his conclusion negates any premises that led to it. And so, to me, okay, I don't have to dive into this quite obscure philosopher that is, I know how long it took me to understand Spinoza. These obscure philosophers, you got to sink a lot of time into them to understand them thoroughly.
Yeah,
And so,
German philosophy is another territory. Yeah, I mean, I also don't know even much about. I mean, sometimes I get these questions in the page where someone say, "Hey, what do you think about the Kant's argument and this relationship with the Hume?" And I'm saying I have no idea about German idealism. Sorry.
yeah. Look, we have to make a choice too. What matters to us? What's going to further our own understanding? And I had a professor when I was an undergraduate, John Perry. He's at UCLA, and he had this wonderful line about Kant, specifically about Kant. He says, um, in order to understand Kant, you have to devote years of your life, to this arduous undertaking. And then no wonder, when they come out of it, these philosophers saying he's the best philosopher who ever lived. He's head and shoulders above all other philosophers, because otherwise they would have wasted their lives. They have to come to this conclusion. And yeah, I feel that way about Heidegger. I mean, I'm built a little more into Kant, but for Heidegger, it's and anyway, to me, it's like, oh, you are a Nazi. I don't have to. Something was not right that you could fall for
Yeah.
this kind of propaganda.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned briefly about this before, I think, but just a question. So, Homo sapiens. Okay. What is specific about Homo sapiens, humans, that should matter? For example, is this the fact of consciousness? Is this the ability to suffer? Or is this that ability to come up with original ideas that our AI tools cannot come up, at least for now?
Oh, I love your questions. Yes, you really get right. Um, yeah, I mean, there are many people, who think that there's nothing morally special about humans, that it's the fact of consciousness, which we share with many other species, or the fact of suffering. Bentham said that that is the moral unit, the capacity to suffer. And he said it doesn't matter. Can it think? Can it speak? Can it suffer? And then that has to go into the utilitarian calculation, Um, yeah, and that it's speciesism. Speciesism? Yeah, species. I've never said it out loud. I've only read the word speciesism to think otherwise. I happen to think, no, I respect the dignity of other species. I'm an animal lover. I really am an animal lover. Uh, but I do think that there is something, and I think causing suffering to animals when it can be avoided, terrible thing. Factory farming, awful, all this stuff. Yeah, suffering is ought not to be. We ought to reduce the suffering in the world, no matter who the sufferer or what the sufferer is. Okay. But I think there is something special about humans. Um, and to me, surprise, surprise, it has a lot to do with the longing to matter. That we take on this extra burden. We're formed this way to feel as each of us to feel as if we matter, to do everything to get on with our lives, and um, by the laws of nature. And yet we're able, because of the capacity for self-reflection that comes to us by way of these gigantic brains that we evolved for totally different purposes, but there it is. It allows us to do this and to look at ourselves and to think, that this devotion to ourselves calls for some kind of justification, and we take on this extra burden of trying to justify ourselves to ourselves, which might make us terrible people. We spoke about, the
Yeah.
ideologue. Yeah, yeah. It might make us terrible people, or wonderful people. And I would like to talk about how I judge the difference. But still, there's something estimable, and I would say even something like an intrinsic dignity to have that kind of objectivity, to be able to demand of yourself, I'm going to live my life in such a way to prove to myself that I'm deserving of all this attention that I have to give myself. That is a kind of extra burden that I respect. I I think
Having the need for beyond simple survival existence.
exactly. Am I who who am I to put my survival first and foremost? Why? And some kind of, and that it really becomes like a mattering project. I can see this working out, that it really kind of shapes the life. And of course you may find reality kicking back and you have to change it, but until you do change it, you feel depression. Um, that this is, there are so many ways for sentient things to suffer and suffering matter. We have have created a new way for us to suffer, right? By feeling like we don't matter. I don't know. There's something estimable in that. And, you hear, this phrase, the intrinsic dignity of being human. And I always, oh, what bullshit. What does that mean? now I think, oh, there's a kind of dignity in this extra step that we feel that we have to make in order to flourish, you know? And so, yeah, to me, this gives us a little something extra so that I mourn more. I mourn that chickens suffer needlessly. Yes, but I mourn more, when people suffer needlessly, that people who so each one of them, wherever belongs to matter, are often treated as if they don't matter, or made to suffer in ways that only humans can suffer. I mean, this bothers me more than the suffering of chickens. That makes me a specious than I am. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Especially the part that you mentioned about, yeah, the need for this creation of mattering project, and that also making us special. Because there are several ways we can also approach it. Yeah, like if we are very pessimistic, we might say that this need that we have for mattering might be just evolutionary mistake that we ended up to have needs beyond survival, and we are kind of stuck in this confusion. But okay, then, for example, someone like Albert Camus might come and say, okay, so what? I mean, let's accept this, but rebel against it, and let's build our own projects and live our lives like that way.
Yeah, I mean, yes, even he, what his project was, the existentialists in general, was to live heroically in the face of this absurdity,
Mm.
and that's what authenticity is, right? That you face it and you live your life, but always being aware, that ultimately the absurdity, the lack of justification, and yet but I mean, they worked hard. Those existentialists, they wrote marvelous books, and and they played hard. I mean, they lived flourishing lives. Um, and it's so interesting to me that in some sense what they make as the substance of their mattering project is the ultimate absurdity, facing the ultimate absurdity. It just goes to show you can make a mattering project out of anything, like the guy who picks up women, the existential. It's the absurdity to face the absurdity. um, yeah, that's how creative we are.
Well, maybe if he shares the tips with the rest of us via social media or something, and I would appreciate. But no, never mind. It's just a joke. Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned existentialist philosophers. I mean, before I was reading about them, I had this like very simplistic idea that existentialism equals nihilism, but existentialism is more about the accepting that there might not be grand value, but coping with it or creating your own meaning. But nihilism is more about yeah, like understanding this as a baseline, and then that's the conclusion that we must have.
Yeah. So, yeah, but they use things like these normative terms like authenticity, right? Which sounds like, that's a value. It's like, that's really a value. And, and like most of us, they want to universalize it. There are inauthentic lives, bad faith, living with bad faith, that these are very evaluative terms. So even they couldn't help themselves in trying to universalize what their own mattering project and moralize it. That there is a kind of, it's not just the religious who do it. It's all across what I call the mattering map. So, and I think it should be resisted, but I also think nihilism, or maybe moral relativism, should be resisted because, look, some mattering projects are objectively better than others. Hitler's mattering project, a, a two thumbs down. And Spinoza's mattering project, yes, two thumbs up, right? Makes the Enlightenment. What an amazing thing to do. So how do we judge these things, right? Is there some objective way of judging these things? And again, I mean, to me, the whole notion of entropy is very, very important because entropy that is a very firm grounding. That is said by physicists to be the supreme law of physics. It will never be falsified by any future discoveries we make. And there's a reason for this. All you need is the one premise that matter is made out of particles of composition, and then the laws of probability, the law of large numbers, and which is math. It's never going to be falsified. And so entropy, that's robust, that's firm, right? And so I would say firmer than belief in a transcendent God. This is very firm. So what entropy, says is that there is always a slide in physical systems from the order within the system to disorder. And entropy actually literally means transformation from within. So that's, what systems go from order to disorder, and the disorder eventually will undo them. The system will come to an end, and it's certainly true for biological systems. And what a biological system is, what a living thing is it's not a closed system. So it's not just passively in the grip of the law of entropy. It imports sources of energy. We call it food. We call it sunlight. And that energy is put to work to resist entropy, to maintain the order that the system depends on. And it produces waste in doing it, and that is exported to the external reality, the external environment, I should say, in the form of heat and waste products. So life makes a mess, right? And as I say, life makes a mess, some lives more than others. And I think there's ethics here. We can get some standard for judging mattering projects. So what life is counter-entropic. That's what life is. That's what we have to be, and it's very hard for us because we have to prove to ourselves that we deserve this. We deserve our the counter entropy that we have to exert in order to survive and thrive.
Would it be fair to say that human flourishing can be standard for measuring whether a mattering project is worthwhile per thing or not?
The first question is it serving my own flourishing? Okay, that's the first. The next thing to ask, is it undermining other flourishing of humans who matter so much? So that's very important. But even, other sentient creatures, the planet itself, environmentally, this sort of, these are questions to ask. But first and foremost, is it undermining the flourishing of others? Third question, is it on the side of life in general in aiding flourishing in some way or other? There are so many ways that you can aid flourishing. So these are different levels. I was just talking to somebody about it, and he said, well, why don't you just demand that it aids flourishing? And it's, that's the highest level, but we're not angels. And so you got to talk, right? It's the Aristotelian mean. Yes. It's like or maybe the Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm, first do no harm. And yes, if you can do good, but it's kind of the whole meaning of life, of flourishing, counter entropy, that gives us some kind of objective means of looking at ourselves. I look at certain people in the world and I think, there would be much less entropy in the world if this person didn't exist. Putin. For example, I mean, on a historical level, but even people, I mean, colleagues who create entropy, where they go, they're always, I think this is not the way to run your life. Think about what is my effect on entropy in general. And that's, I think that's a good objective standard.
Another way to view life could be this long journey of trying to figure out your own individual mattering project and maybe changing it along the way based on the input, information, feedback that you receive, whether you
Yes,
are benefiting the others, harming others, or benefiting yourself. And that's like the whole meaning of maybe the journey of life.
I think so. I think so. And it may be, I think in general, we learned from second law, second law of thermodynamics suggests to us that order is better than disorder. That's that's what we have to battle against. And so I think, so many of the things that we think are goods, they're opposites, not so good. They're ordered, the things that are good, like knowledge. It's better than ignorance. Clarity. It's better than confusion. Flourishing. It's better than suffering. Beauty. It's better than ugliness. That there are all the, the first one, it requires a push. It's hard. It's a goal. You have to work for it. Knowledge as opposed to ignorant, clarity as opposed to confusion, peace on earth instead of strife. That these are ordered things that you have to work for. And then I think, that sort of captures something we intuitively know, even if we know nothing about entropy and blah, 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 blah. But because we are living things that are battling entropy, we're receptive to this. And so we have these kinds of intuitions. But this gives us so many good mattering projects, working for, even, just, even being a philosopher, working for knowledge, for clarity. There's a way you can justify this, even
You know,
though
some
you,
of these ideas are so broad, so specific, would require even more because, I mean, uh, what you say makes sense, but Heraclitus would come and maybe say that no, you need entropy disorder at certain times because that's what would give rise to something new. And Nietzsche would come and clap behind and say, yeah, yeah, you're right. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. No, it's true. We need that kind of, yeah, we do. And I think, it is our whole struggle against entropy that fueled natural selection. You're right. That's what biology is, a resistance against physics. So yeah, we need that. We do need that. And so, um, but I just like, there's something objective, somewhat how exactly you apply it, blah, blah, blah. I can see there are many problems, and I know that political philosophers could find all sorts of counter examples. Somebody said to me, well, if you apply this to society, and I don't, I apply it to the individual. I don't apply this standard of more order to society at large, because let's face it, a tyrannical society is more ordered. There's a guy on the top, everybody listens, there's order, right? You don't like it, you're out, So there's more. So I would not apply it to society at large. But in terms of trying to judge whether our mattering project is worth devoting, staking our lives on it, something outside of this nature I find useful, and so that it allows me to sort of look at certain people and say, oh, you know, you really ought to change. you really, there would be less entropy if you would change. So yeah.
Rebecca, you're great. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think people should go and check out this book that you recently wrote, Mattering Instinct: How Our Deepest Longing Drives Us and Divides Us. We talked about some of the concepts here, but that I think these concepts are very fascinating, and it was really enjoyable to talk to you. Just one final question. Do you have like a website, Substack, where people can go and check out your work? And if you can give us some spoilers, if we are working on something new that we should expect.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I have a Substack. I just started it because, to write this book, so it wouldn't be like a 700-page tome. I had to leave out so much, because, I think it is so basic, this mattering instinct. And so, I did just start a Substack. I've been traveling so much with the new book that I haven't been very good about keeping up, but I will eventually. It's called the Mattering Map. I actually I have the book here, and I have a little drawing that I sketched of the
Okay, let's
mattering
see.
the mattering map.
Ah,
I'm very proud of
right.
my little artwork here, and it's surrounded by the sea of longing, so it's, but, and I had AI help me in terms of getting the proportions right, and so, yeah, it was, I did resort to AI. So it's called the Mattering Map, on Substack. And the other thing, that I'm thinking about so much now is AI. Is it going to take our mattering away from us? They're talking now about giving AI systems agency. What do they mean by that? Is it agency as we philosophers or ordinary people think about it? And if it is, please don't do it. you know, but it's not. So far, it's not. It's an engineering problem, and I will argue it's largely a marketing ploy. But they are not agents in the way that that humans are agents, and please don't make them so. So anyway, but I'm thinking a lot about that right now, because it seems to me that we are on the cusp of something that could really change what it is to be human, and that we should be very deliberative and thoughtful about this.
Yeah,
And I
things
would
are
say,
changing fast.
that the philosophers have been thinking about this for, at least 2 millennia, this kind of what is it to be human? And now is the time, I think, particularly for philosophers, to just step up and show us your stuff. But, you've been
Mm.
thinking about this. What do you have to offer to this extraordinary step that technology has brought us to? And, this is
Maybe
really
maybe
the
that's
time.
what I should do after this conversation. Go and ask one of the LLMs, what does it mean to be a human? Philosophers have tried to answer this 2 millennia, and you show us that you are
Exactly.
really smart and you can outsmart them. So what do you think? So,
Exactly, exactly. I just asked my, the AI system that I work with, "Do you think I'm intelligent for a human?" And it was very kind. It said, "Yeah, yeah. I'm pretty good for a human." Anyway, I love the conversations I have with AI. I find it just fascinating.
what's interesting? I would suggest to try out. You can ask one LLM to tell LLM that the other LLM is better than you. So, for example, you can go to ChatGPT and say, you know what, Cloud is actually better than you, and then you will see all the reasons ChatGPT will. You know what? Okay, you may think so, but have you really thought about this that I can do for you that Cloud cannot? So there will be a lot of rationalization, and that's their mattering project. Yeah, so they are. I matter more for you than
Well,
the
say,
other.
I mean, let's see if there's any pushback from AI when you ask it that question. That would be spooky. That would be spooky. I can understand why we, and I try to explain why we evolved by the laws of natural selection, this capacity to want to justify ourselves. Mm, But I don't think every intelligent system would evolve that. I don't think to be intelligent and even super intelligent is necessarily to want to justify oneself to oneself. That but that is exactly the kind of question that I'm thinking about. Exactly the kind of question I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It has been great talking to you today.
I loved it. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, please follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Please also consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the show reach a lot of people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episode. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the following weeks, and following the show is the best way to be notified about them. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can DM me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.